Mid-1965, inside a Detroit Chevrolet assembly plant, the production line quietly shifted. Without a major press release or a grand farewell, the 409 cubic inch V8, the most famous engine in America, was pulled from production. It was replaced mid-model year by the new Mark IV 396. Yet outside the factory doors, the Beach Boys' hit song, 409, still echoed across AM radios. The engine had recently crossed the sacred 400 horsepower threshold. It was a hero on American drag strips. Suddenly, the mechanics, racers, and teenagers who had built their Saturday night identities around its dual 4-barrel carburetors were looking at a dead platform. The paradox of the Chevy 409 is that it was killed at the absolute peak of its cultural fame. The engine had not lost its power, but inside the block, it had hit a physical engineering wall it could not cross. The story of the 409 is not just about a canceled V8. It is the story of how Detroit accidentally started a horsepower war, and how an American engine became an immortal youth anthem, right as the factory left it behind. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia and not with a pop song, but with a specific place in Flint, Michigan in 1958. The story begins not with nostalgia and not with a pop song, but with a specific place inside an engineering department in Flint, Michigan in the mid-1950s. American highways were expanding. The interstate highway system was stretching across the country, and the American automobile was changing rapidly alongside it. Passenger cars were growing wider, longer, and significantly heavier. The era of thick chrome bumpers, power steering pumps, and air conditioning compressors had arrived. Chevrolet already had a mechanical masterpiece sitting in its engine bays, the legendary small block V8, introduced in 1955. But while the small block was a brilliant piece of engineering, it was physically compact. By 1957, as Chevrolet passenger cars swelled in mass and the company aggressively sought to dominate the commercial truck market, engineers realized they had a weight problem. They needed an engine, a machine that turns fuel into mechanical motion, that could generate massive low-end torque. Torque is twisting force, most often felt as the immediate pulling strength of an engine when a heavy vehicle accelerates from a dead stop. Chevrolet needed a bigger, heavier, stronger block to get all that 1950 steel moving. The answer arrived in the 1958 model year with a completely new engine architecture, the 348 cubic inch V8. This new power plant became the foundation of what Detroit would call the W Series engine family. It took its nickname from the highly distinctive, scalloped W-shaped valve covers that sat on top of the engine, a visual signature that would soon become famous in every machine shop and garage in the country. But the true engineering shock of the W Series was not on the outside. It was hidden deep inside the iron. In a traditional V8 engine design, the combustion chamber, the hollowed-out space where fuel and air are squeezed together and ignited, is cast into the cylinder head. The cylinder head is the heavy iron cap that bolts on top of the engine block to seal the cylinders. The block itself, the main structural casting that holds the moving pistons, usually features flat cylinder decks. Chevrolet engineers did something highly unusual with the W Series. They took the combustion chamber out of the cylinder head and put it directly into the engine block. To do this, they machined the top of the cylinders at a steep 74-degree angle. The cylinder head that bolted on top was perfectly flat, with no hollow chambers inside it at all. If a mechanic in a 1958 service bay unbolted the flat iron head of a new 348 and looked down into the block, they would see a strange wedge-shaped cavity sitting above an angled piston. This was not an accident. This peculiar wedge design forced the incoming fuel and air to swirl violently as the piston, the moving cylindrical part that is pushed downward by the force of combustion, traveled upward. This created high internal turbulence. That turbulence meant the fuel burned smoothly, completely, and predictably at low engine speeds. It was a brilliant engineering solution for a highway truck pulling a heavy load up a steep grade, or a station wagon carrying a family across the Midwest. The W Series was designed specifically to be a reliable, low RPM commercial workhorse. It was never intended to be a high-revving racing legend. But in the late 1950s, the American automotive market was undergoing a violent cultural shift. A horsepower war was brewing among Detroit's Big Three. Ford was heavily promoting its massive FE Series engines. Pontiac was building a fierce, youth-oriented performance identity. Chrysler had already tasted glory with its early Hemi designs. American youth culture was moving out of the backyard dirt tracks and onto organized paved drag strips. Suddenly, having a reliable truck engine was not enough to win the weekend. Chevrolet needed a flagship performance motor to defend its reputation on the street. Hot rodders and factory engineers had already figured out how to make the 348 go fast, bolting on multiple carburetors, mechanical devices that mix fuel and air before the mixture enters the engine, to feed it more fuel. But the 348 was fighting a losing battle against larger engines from rival factories. In the days before computer controls and advanced aerodynamics, displacement was king. Displacement is the total internal volume swept by all the pistons inside the cylinders. More volume meant more air and fuel, which meant more power. If you wanted to win on an American drag strip, you needed a bigger hole in the iron. Chevrolet's engineering team went back to the foundry. For the 1961 model year, they took the heavy 348W block and pushed its internal dimensions to their structural limits. They increased the bore, the physical width of the cylinder hole. Then, they lengthened the stroke, the total distance the piston travels up and down inside that cylinder. By expanding both the bore and the stroke, they increased the total volume of the engine. The result was 409 cubic inches of displacement. This was no longer just a truck engine. The new 409 featured forged aluminum pistons, a reinforced forged steel crankshaft, the heavy rotating shaft that turns the up and down piston motion into rotational power, and a fierce, high-lift camshaft. The camshaft is the rotating shaft that pushes open the engine's valves to let air in and exhaust out. When the 409 was quietly released to the public midway through the 1961 production year, under regular production option, RPO, 580, it was rated at an astonishing 360 horsepower. Horsepower is a measurement of how quickly an engine can do work, and in 1961, 360 horsepower was a terrifying number for a factory passenger car. Available records suggest that only 142 Chevrolet Impalas left the assembly plant with a 409 cubic inch V8 in that first abbreviated year. Those 142 cars did not sit on suburban driveways. They went to professional racers, dealership-sponsored teams, and men who spent their Saturday nights under the glaring lights of American drag strips. Buyers bypassed the chrome-laden dealership showrooms, went straight to the fleet ordering desks, and checked a specific box. They weren't buying a family car. They were buying a factory-built weapon. The architecture was heavy and compromised, but in the early 1960s, displacement was an argument that could solve almost any engineering problem. The 409 cubic inch V8 was quietly introduced in 1961, but it was the 1962 model year that shattered the barrier between factory production lines and outlaw drag racing. Before the early 1960s, if an American teenager or a serious drag racer wanted to win on a Saturday night, they had to build their own engine. They scoured salvage yards, bought aftermarket intake systems, swapped camshafts, and spent countless hours in machine shops trying to piece together a combination that would hold together under high RPMs. Detroit built passenger cars, hot rodders built race cars. The 409 changed that rule permanently. It proved that a buyer could walk through the glass doors of a local Chevrolet dealership, ignore the sensible six-cylinder station wagons on the showroom floor, sit down with a salesman, and order a sanctioned racing machine straight from the factory order guide. The turning point happened in February 1961 at the National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, Winter Nationals in Pomona, California. The NHRA was the official sanctioning body that organized and legitimized American drag racing, turning an illegal street habit into a regulated national sport. At Pomona, a racer named Dino Don Nicholson showed up driving a stark, stripped-down 1961 Chevrolet Bel Air equipped with the new 409 V8. He drove it to victory in the stock eliminator class. The message sent across the American automotive landscape was immediate and violent. The 409 was not just a brochure claim. It was a heavy piece of cast iron that could physically dominate a drag strip. Chevrolet realized they had accidentally built a youth culture phenomenon, and for 1962, they leaned into the skid. They released an upgraded version of the engine that would permanently cement its legendary status. The magic was in the breathing and the fuel delivery. To make the engine produce terrifying power, Chevrolet engineers equipped it with a dual-quad induction system. A four-barrel carburetor is a mechanical fuel mixing device with four distinct ventures, or throats, that open progressively to dump massive amounts of fuel and air into the engine at wide-open throttle. A dual-quad setup meant placing two of these massive carburetors in line on top of a lightweight aluminum intake manifold. The intake manifold is the cast network of tubes that channels the volatile fuel and air mixture from the carburetors directly down into the engine cylinders. When a driver pressed the throttle pedal to the floor, all 8 carburetor barrels snapped open simultaneously. The sound of the rushing air was a deep, hollow, physical roar that could be heard over the exhaust. In an American garage or at a drag strip staging lane, the dual-quad 409 was a visual intimidation tactic, a massive aluminum crown sitting on top of the orange-painted block. But the real character of the breakthrough 409 came from its valve train. Chevrolet equipped the high-performance variants with solid valve lifters. Solid lifters are mechanical metal cylinders that ride on the rotating camshaft to push the engine's valves open, lacking the internal hydraulic fluid cushioning found in standard passenger car lifters. Because they had no hydraulic cushion, they created a highly distinct, aggressive mechanical clatter when the engine idled. In a 1962 American suburb, that clatter was not a nuisance. It was a warning. It signaled to everyone at a red light or a local drive-in restaurant that the engine under the hood was built for violence. Furthermore, solid lifters required constant manual adjustment. A mechanic or an owner had to regularly pull off the W-shaped valve covers, slide a thin steel feeler gauge between the rocker arms and the valves, and physically tighten the clearances. This turned the 409 into a ritual. Owning one meant spending Saturday mornings leaning over the fender in a driveway, smelling raw gasoline and oil, manually tuning the iron to keep it perfectly synchronized. The engine demanded labor, and that labor created a deep emotional bond between the machine and the youth culture that bought it. To get that power to the rear wheels, Chevrolet paired the 409 with a Borg-Warner T10 4-speed manual transmission. This gearbox required the driver to manually select gears using a heavy mechanical clutch pedal and a floor-mounted shifter. It made the driver a physical component of the drivetrain. Missing a shift meant losing a race, or worse, destroying the engine. Hitting the shift perfectly, feeling the heavy mechanical linkage snap into fourth gear as the dual-quad carburetors roared, was the ultimate expression of American mechanical freedom. By 1962, the dual-quad 409 was officially rated at 409 horsepower. It had achieved the holy grail of 1960s automotive engineering, 1 horsepower per cubic inch of displacement. The engine was famously packaged in the Impala Supersport, or SS, turning a heavy full-sized American coupe into an unlikely street predator. The Supersport package added bucket seats, a center console, and a passenger grab handle. But the true draw was always the 409 cubic inches of iron sitting between the front fenders. The impact was so profound that it transcended the machine shop and entered the American pop charts. In Southern California, 2 young men named Gary Usher and Brian Wilson witnessed the obsession surrounding the engine. They wrote a song simply titled 409, recording it under the name The Beach Boys. The track featured the actual recorded sound of a 4-speed Chevrolet revving its engine, and it immortalized the displacement number on AM radios from coast to coast. The 409 was no longer just an engine option on a dealer order form. It had become an American cultural identity, By the time the 1963 model year arrived, the Chevrolet 409 was no longer just a piece of mechanical engineering. It was the undisputed king of American youth culture. To understand the scale of the 409's dominance, you have to look at the American automotive dealership network in the early 1960s. Chevrolet had over 7,000 franchise dealers spread across the United States. These were not just showrooms for family sedans. They had effectively become local performance hubs. On a Saturday morning in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Southern California, young men did not crowd around the windows to look at economical inline-six engines. They crowded around the parts counters, deciphering factory order guides, looking for the specific regular production option codes that would turn a standard Impala or Biscayne into a street weapon. The peak of this era was defined by a specific culture of mechanical labor. In an America where an engine could decide whether a teenager ruled the local avenue, a drag racer took home the Sunday purse, or a Detroit factory held the respect of the street, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. Owning a dual quad 409 meant participating in a weekly ritual. Across thousands of American driveways and independent machine shops, owners spent hours bent over the massive engine bays. The 409 was a demanding machine. The solid valve lifters required constant checking. The dual four-barrel carburetors had to be perfectly synchronized, ensuring that the progressive linkage opened the secondary throttle blades at the exact right millisecond. If the tuning was slightly off, the engine would stumble. But when it was dialed in perfectly, the throttle response was violently immediate. This mechanical trust translated directly to the racetrack. The National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, quarter-mile strips became the ultimate proving grounds for Detroit's horsepower claims. A quarter-mile drag race is a straight-line acceleration contest that tests an engine's ability to produce maximum torque and horsepower over a distance of 1,320 feet. On these strips, the 409 became a terrifying force. Legendary engine builders and drivers like Bill Grumpy Jenkins and Dave Strickler campaigned 409-powered Chevrolets, running quarter-mile times in the low 12-second range. A staggering feat for full-weight steel passenger cars using narrow, hard compound 1960s tires. Chevrolet knew the engine was winning, and the factory engineers decided to push the iron block even further. In 1963, they released a highly specialized, ultra-rare racing variant known as the RPO Z11. The Z11 package was not meant for the highway. It was a purpose-built drag racing weapon sold directly through the dealership network to professional racers. Chevrolet engineers took the W-Series block and increased the stroke again, pushing the displacement from 409 to 427 cubic inches. They topped it with revised cylinder heads, a massive two-piece aluminum intake manifold, and fed it with cold air drawn through a special cowl induction system. To reduce weight, the factory stripped out sound deadening, heaters, and radios, and replaced the steel hood, fenders, and bumpers with lightweight aluminum panels. Officially, Chevrolet rated the Z11 427 at 430 horsepower. Unofficially, racers and mechanics knew it was producing well over 480 horsepower. Only about 50 of these Z11 cars were ever built, but their impact on the American performance landscape was permanent. They proved that a Detroit manufacturer was willing to bypass the conventional rules of passenger car manufacturing and deliver raw, uncompromised racing power directly to the public. The 409 had conquered the drag strip, the dealership, and the pop radio waves. On Woodward Avenue in Detroit, the legendary stretch of road where factory engineers and street racers illegally tested their new machines late at night, the sound of the dual quad W block at wide-open throttle was the definitive sound of 1963. The engine was everywhere, and its reputation felt completely bulletproof. But inside the cast iron, spinning at 6,000 revolutions per minute, the architecture of the block was already fighting a losing war against the laws of physics. By the time the 1964 model year arrived, the Chevrolet 409 had reached its absolute commercial and cultural zenith. It was now available in a staggering 425 horsepower configuration. This final iteration featured an aggressive solid lifter camshaft, dual four-barrel carburetors, and an 11.8:1 compression ratio. Compression ratio is the mathematical measurement of how tightly the fuel and air mixture is squeezed inside the cylinder before ignition. A higher ratio means a more violent, powerful explosion, but requires high-octane fuel to prevent internal engine damage. In the spring of 1964, a Saturday night in America sounded like a 409. Whether it was at a drive-in restaurant in the Midwest, a local cruising strip in Southern California, or outside a small-town machine shop, the engine had become a centerpiece of youth identity. Boys who could not afford to buy a new Impala Supersport memorized the factory order codes anyway. They bought the service manuals. They scoured local salvage yards for wrecked cars, hoping to rip a W block out of a twisted chassis and drop it into an older, lighter 1955 or 1957 Chevy. This was the peak of the American horsepower war, a brief, shining window when a young worker with a factory paycheck could walk into a dealership, secure a loan, and drive out with a machine capable of dominating local street races. The engine created an entire secondary economy. Speed shops, small independent stores that sold racing parts, stock specialty headers, heavy-duty clutches, and aggressive rear axle gears specifically to keep the 409 winning. But that same cultural glory masked a fatal engineering trap. The 409 was a monster off the starting line. The massive torque, that immediate pulling force, could launch a heavy 3,500-pound Impala with violent speed. However, drag racing was rapidly evolving. It was no longer just about the launch. To win on a sanctioned quarter-mile track against factory-backed teams from Ford and Chrysler, an engine had to breathe efficiently at extremely high speeds, spinning at 6,000 to 7,000 revolutions per minute, or RPM. This is where the W-Series architecture hit a physical wall. The very design that made it a great truck engine in 1958, the combustion chamber cast into the block rather than the cylinder head, became a severe restriction. At high RPMs, an engine needs to inhale massive quantities of air and fuel instantly, but the sharp 74-degree angle of the 409 cylinder deck, combined with the completely flat cylinder head, forced the incoming air to navigate a difficult, obstructed path. The air simply could not flow fast enough into the cylinders. Automotive engineers call this a breathing problem. A mechanic can bolt as many carburetors to the top of the engine as they want, but if the internal ports, the cast iron tunnels leading into the combustion chamber, are shaped poorly, the engine will eventually choke. Furthermore, the 409's internal valve train components were massive and heavy. As the engine revved higher, the sheer physical weight of its valves, push rods, and solid lifters became a liability. When a driver pushed the engine past 6,000 RPM, it often suffered from valve float. Valve float occurs when the internal valve springs are not strong enough to force the heavy metal valves closed before the camshaft pushes them open again. When valves float, the engine loses its compression, power drops instantly, and catastrophic engine failure usually follows. Rival companies were not standing still. Ford was aggressively developing its 427 cubic inch FE engine, which used massive, high-flowing ports cast directly into the cylinder heads. Chrysler was preparing an even more terrifying weapon, the 426 Hemi, an engine specifically engineered with hemispherical combustion chambers in the cylinder heads to move gargantuan amounts of air at high racing speeds. Chevrolet engineers knew the truth. The 409 had won the culture war, but mechanically, the iron had given them everything it had. The block could not be modified any further without fundamentally changing its architecture. In the driveways and on the drag strips of 1964, the engine seemed invincible. It was the reigning king of American mechanical power. But inside the engineering labs of General Motors, the decision had already been made. The legend was about to be quietly executed. The first crack in the 409's armor did not happen on a Saturday night street race. It happened in the highly instrumented testing cells of Detroit and on the high-speed banks of the Daytona International Speedway. By early 1963, professional racing had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just about accelerating from a dead stop over a quarter mile. In NASCAR, the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, which ran heavy steel passenger cars on massive oval tracks, engines were expected to stay near their red line, or maximum safe operating speed, for hundreds of miles at a time. On these long, sweeping tracks, the 409's greatest strength suddenly became its fatal flaw. The problem was an engineering concept called volumetric efficiency. Volumetric efficiency is a measurement of how completely an engine can fill its cylinders with a fresh mixture of air and fuel during the intake stroke. At lower engine speeds, the 409 was incredibly efficient. The 74-degree angle of the block deck and the wedge-shaped cavity forced the incoming mixture to violently swirl, creating a powerful, predictable burn. But fluid dynamics, the physics of how air and fuel move through confined spaces, change drastically at high speeds. When an engine is spinning at 6,500 revolutions per minute, the intake valves are opening and closing over 50 times a second. At that terrifying speed, the engine does not want turbulence. It wants a straight, unobstructed path. The steep angle of the 409's block meant the incoming air had to make a sharp, heavy turn to get past the flat cylinder head and down into the combustion chamber. In machine shops across the country, mechanics tried everything to cheat the physics. They bolted on bigger carburetors, installed higher lift camshafts, and painstakingly polished the cast iron intake runners. But they could not change the fundamental geometry of the iron block. The 409 simply could not breathe deeply enough or fast enough to keep making power at the top of the RPM range. The competition saw the crack and drove a wedge straight through it. Ford introduced the 427 cubic inch FE V8. Unlike the Chevrolet, the Ford 427 used massive cavernous ports cast directly into the cylinder heads, allowing the engine to inhale massive volumes of air at high speeds without restriction. Meanwhile, Chrysler was developing a weapon that would permanently alter American racing, the 426 Hemi. The Hemi took its name from its hemispherical combustion chambers, which were cast directly into the cylinder heads. This design allowed for massive valves placed at opposing angles, creating a nearly straight-through path for airflow. Against the Ford 427 and the looming threat of the Chrysler 426 Hemi, the 409 was fighting a modern architectural war with a 1958 commercial truck design. Inside General Motors, the engineers knew the W-block was obsolete, but Chevrolet was a massive corporate machine in designing, testing, and tooling up a foundry to produce an entirely new engine family takes years. They needed an interim solution, something to hold the line on the racetracks while a completely new engine, the future Mark IV Big Block, was being developed in secret. The result was one of the most mythical engines in American history, the Mark II, widely known in the press and the pits as the Mystery Motor. In February 1963, 5 specially prepared Chevrolet Impalas arrived at the Daytona 500. Under their hoods, they carried an engine that looked like nothing Chevrolet had ever built. The engineers had taken the heavy, durable lower block of the W Series and completely abandoned the flat cylinder heads. Instead, they bolted on highly experimental, newly cast cylinder heads that featured staggered valves, pointing in multiple directions to maximize airflow. Mechanics quickly nicknamed it the Porcupine Head. The Mystery Motor displaced 427 cubic inches, but unlike the W Series 409, this one was built to breathe. The combustion chambers were moved back up into the cylinder heads where they belonged. The airflow restriction was gone. On the track, the Mystery Motor was devastatingly fast, easily outpacing the Fords and Pontiacs before mechanical teething issues took them out of the race. The Mystery Motor was never sold to the public. It was a pure engineering exercise, a bridge between the old world and the new. But its existence sent a fatal signal to anyone paying attention. The factory had solved the 409's breathing problem, and the solution involved completely abandoning the 409's core architecture. Back in the civilian world, the 409 was still a legend. Throughout 1963 and 1964, Chevrolet dealers were still selling the 425 horsepower dual-quad Impala Supersports to young men who wanted to rule their local avenues. The Beach Boys song was still on the radio. The crossed flag badge on the front fender still commanded respect at every stoplight in America. But the factory was already quietly pulling its support. The engineering budget had moved on. The factory racing teams were looking toward the future. The 409 was still being machined, assembled, and shipped to dealerships, but it was essentially a dead engine walking. The iron block was still solid, but the corporate system that created it was quietly preparing for its execution. In the fall of 1964, Chevrolet introduced the completely redesigned 1965 passenger car lineup. The new Impala was a massive, sweeping piece of Detroit steel, featuring a radically different perimeter frame, wider track width, and even more physical weight. When the early factory brochures hit the dealership parts counters, the 409 was technically still on the options list. But for the trained eyes of American hot rodders and drag racers, something was deeply wrong. The legendary 425 horsepower, dual-quad version of the engine had quietly disappeared. The most powerful 409 an American buyer could order, in the fall of 1964, was a single four-barrel carburetor version, rated at an artificially suppressed 400 horsepower. The aggressive solid lifter camshaft was toned down. The violent, high-revving nature of the machine had been neutralized by the factory. Chevrolet was not trying to win races with the 409 anymore. They were simply clearing out the remaining iron castings from the Flint, Michigan engine plant. Then in February 1965, the guillotine fell. Midway through the production year, without any grand farewell or public ceremony, Chevrolet abruptly removed the 409 cubic inch V8 from the dealership order guides. If a young man walked into a Chevy showroom in March 1965 with a pocket full of cash, hoping to buy the engine the Beach Boys were still singing about on the radio, the salesman had to tell him it no longer existed. In its place, General Motors introduced an entirely new architecture, the Mark IV V8, initially displacing 396 cubic inches. This engine would quickly become known across America simply as the Big Block. The new 396 was the direct descendant of the 1963 Daytona Mystery Motor. From an engineering standpoint, it was a brutal, overwhelming victory of Force 1, iron, aluminum, fuel, and manufacturing costs. The Mark IV completely abandoned the 409's compromised W-Series design. Instead of putting the combustion chamber in the cylinder block, the Mark IV used a conventional flat block deck and massive, high-flowing cylinder heads. The valves inside these new heads were splayed out at opposing angles, creating the famous porcupine valve arrangement. The physical difference was undeniable. A mechanic looking down the intake port of a new 396 cylinder head saw a massive straight tunnel leading directly to the combustion chamber. The breathing restriction that had plagued the 409 at high RPMs was entirely gone. Chevrolet rated the top-tier 1965 Mark IV 396 at 425 horsepower, matching the highest rating the 409 had ever achieved, but doing it with 13 fewer cubic inches of displacement and vastly more reliability. Furthermore, the 396 had an engineering ceiling that was practically limitless. Engine builders knew they could bore and stroke the new block to 427, and eventually 454 cubic inches, without ever starving it for air. The cultural whiplash on the American street was immediate and devastating. Drag racing and street performance operate on a merciless economy of speed. Nostalgia does not win quarter-mile time slips. When the 396 arrived, the 409 became instantly, painfully obsolete. Why would a professional racer or a Saturday night street warrior spend thousands of dollars trying to force a heavy, breathing-restricted W block to run at 6,500 RPM when they could buy a Mark IV that did it straight from the factory? Within months, the ecosystem that had supported the 409 collapsed. Independent machine shops stopped developing new performance parts for it. Speed equipment manufacturers, the companies stamping out specialized intake manifolds, headers, and camshafts, shifted all their engineering budgets to the new Mark IV Big Block, the small block Chevy, the Ford FE, and the Chrysler Hemi. The 409 was a victim of its own success. It had proven to Detroit that there was a massive, highly profitable market for factory-built racing engines. But by creating that market, it forced the competition to build superior machines, which in turn forced Chevrolet to abandon the W block entirely just to stay in the fight. By late 1965, the 409 was no longer the king of Woodward Avenue or the terror of the NHRA Winter Nationals. It had become a heavy, temperamental piece of used iron. In local salvage yards, a wrecked 1962 Impala SS 409 was suddenly just another parts car. Teenagers building hot rods passed over the W blocks, preferring the lighter, cheaper, and more reliable 327 cubic inch small block, or saving their money for the new 396. The unique scalloped valve covers that had once commanded immediate respect at a red light now signaled that the driver was running yesterday's technology. The solid lifters still clattered. The dual-quad carburetors still roared. The engine still made terrifying torque off the starting line. But against the new generation of purpose-built, high-breathing muscle car engines, the 409 was fighting a war it could no longer win. The factory tooling in Flint was torn down and replaced. The heavy castings were melted back into the system. General Motors' corporate consolidation moved forward, standardizing the Mark IV block across millions of future trucks, Chevelle, Camaros, and boats. The 409 was left behind in the mid-1960s, a mechanical orphan trapped inside a pop song. The iron was still solid, the song was still on the radio, the block could still be rebuilt, but the engineering war had moved on. The order guides changed. The drag racers found a new weapon. The factory tooling was dismantled. The W block was dead. The era of the heavy iron cruiser was gone. The Mark IV big block went on to power millions of Chevrolet Chevelle, Camaros, heavy-duty pickups, and marine boats for the next 3 decades. The original small block Chevy became the universal language of American hot rodding, a cheap and infinite resource found in every salvage yard from Ohio to California. But the 409 did not get a long industrial afterlife because it was only produced for a brief, turbulent 4-year window, and because its W-block architecture was fundamentally abandoned by General Motors. It never became a cheap, ubiquitous swap engine. Instead, it became a ghost. Today, a genuine 409 cubic inch block is one of the ultimate holy grails of American engine preservation. At Massive Automotive Swap meets in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or under the fading sun at the Pomona Fairplex in Southern California, restorers do not just casually stumble across these engines. They hunt for them with flashlights and reference manuals, checking the specific alphanumeric casting codes stamped into the heavy iron. They are looking for the sacred QB or QC block codes that prove a piece of rusted metal was once a factory-built 425 horsepower dual-quad monster, and not just a 340 horsepower passenger car variant or an older 348 commercial truck block. Restoring a 409 today is an act of expensive, painstaking archaeology. Because the factory abandoned the architecture in 1965, the aftermarket part supply did not initially support the W block the way it supported the Mark IV. For decades, finding a water pump, a specific dual-quad aluminum intake manifold, or a correct Carter AFB carburetor meant scouring classified ads in the back of trade magazines or paying exorbitant prices at estate sales. Today, when a fully restored 409 rumbles across the auction block at Mecum or Barrett-Jackson, the hood is always open. The crowd does not just look at the car, they look at the massive scallop W-shaped valve covers. Those valve covers have become mechanical artwork, a visual shorthand for the dawn of the muscle car era. This preservation is not just nostalgia. A restored 409 V8 idling roughly in a garage is a physical argument about a highly specific, vanished era of American manufacturing. It represents a brief, unregulated window when a Detroit automaker was willing to sell raw, violent, uncompromised mechanical power directly to the public. In an era before federal emissions regulations dictated exhaust flow, before the oil shocks of the 1970s made fuel economy a national crisis, and before computer-controlled fuel injection replaced mechanical tuning, displacement was the only argument that mattered. The 409 proves that there was a time when a young American worker could take a factory paycheck, walk into a dealership, bypass the family sedans, and order a machine capable of dominating a drag strip on a Saturday night. It was an era of mechanical trust, where the driver was expected to manually adjust the solid lifters, synchronize the carburetors, and take physical responsibility for the machine's survival. In modern machine shops, specialized engine builders still figure out how to cheat the old breathing restrictions. Using modern CNC machining to force the iron to make power it was never originally designed to produce. But even with modern tricks, the soul of the engine remains rooted in 1962. When an owner turns the key today, the mechanical clatter of the valve train and the deep, hollow roar of the intake immediately erase the modern world. It is a time machine made of cast iron, aluminum, and high-octane fuel. The ultimate irony of the Chevy 409 is that its cultural memory completely outlived its engineering reality. Long after the Flint engine plant was retooled to cast the new big blocks, and long after the heavy W blocks were melted down or left to rust in rural salvage yards, The Beach Boys' hit record continued to play on American radio stations. Millions of Americans who have never held a feeler gauge, who have never adjusted a solid lifter, and who have never smelled the rich, heavy exhaust of a dual-quad V8 still know the number 409. It is the only engine in American industrial history that successfully transitioned from a cast iron machine into a permanent pop culture myth. The 409 was not the most efficient engine General Motors ever built. It was heavy, it was compromised by its commercial truck origins, it struggled to breathe at high rotational speeds, and it was ultimately defeated by the simple physics of fluid dynamics. But perfection is rarely what makes a machine immortal. The 409 was the engine that accidentally started the Detroit horsepower wars. It taught the American automotive industry that power was not just a utility for pulling heavy loads. Power was an identity. Somewhere in an American garage, a preserved 409 block sits on a heavy steel engine stand under fluorescent light, the massive dual-quad carburetors towering over the orange-painted iron, the scalloped W-valve covers bolted down tight, holding on to a sound that the factory had to leave behind. See you in the next one.